Hey, welcome back to another episode of Ecommerce On Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and Isba. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, it's season 2. How you feeling?
I'm good, man. It's been a while. How have you been?
Oh, fantastic. I feel like summer always flies by. I have enjoyed it quite a bit out here in Utah, hiking, mountain biking, just getting all outside, and it's been really enjoyable.
That's awesome. Yeah, I went a different direction. We decided to move to Canada. This is where I usually make a joke about the election, but the reality is my wife got a temporary job placement up here. We're in Montreal. I've only been yelled at in French about a dozen times in a couple weeks, but it's beautiful so far. But ask me in January how I feel about it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to start hearing your French accent come out pretty soon, right?
I can say boulangerie. That's about it. That's bakery.
There we go. There we go. So this season, e-commerce on tap, what's kind of the agenda? What's the thesis for those that are just tuning in for the first time? Let's give a kind of quick overview of what e-commerce on tap is.
Yeah, this season we've got a great slate of companies that we're going to profile. We're going to stick tried and true with what's worked out for us in the past, where each week we tell the founding story of a well-known company, reverse engineer their supply chain, and then talk about their exit potential and what they would maybe need to do differently.
I'm really excited for this season. Today, we're talking about ButcherBox, which for me, I love a good steak. So I'm excited to dive into ButcherBox and their whole story. It's pretty phenomenal in terms of the scale and what they've achieved without really any external funding. So before we dive into ButcherBox, though, we always start with kind of tidbits of the week, what caught your eye. And so I'm curious, Aaron, did anything, catch your eye in the e-commerce world this past week?
Yeah, there was a seismic shot across the collective e-commerce bow from Congress. There's a bill that's been introduced that's being considered right now that effectively will close the 321 loophole for a lot of brands. So what they're doing is, first and foremost, they're going to block textiles and apparel from being imported with the de minimis rule. And then they're going to charge $2 on every shipment that comes in via de minimis. And this is obviously a huge thing. I mean, we've talked about this on episodes last season where, just the enormous surge in people exploiting this loophole. Shein and Temu are estimated to account for about a third of all de minimis shipments in general. So this is very much aimed at those types of shippers. It's still unclear if this is going to impact people shipping directly from China in the same way that people shipping from Mexico or Canada will be impacted. But Congress is basically saying they've had enough of these loopholes and they're working to close them pretty aggressively.
Yeah, it's a really interesting take because I think in parts of Europe and maybe some other parts of, Australia and South America, they have like a tax on imports like that are under a certain amount. So I guess I'm curious to see, is it going to be an added tax, which means these items will become a bit more expensive? Are they just going to completely block it? What that actual legislation is going to look like, but definitely something to keep an eye on. And even I know brands that ship through Section 321 from Mexico, right? So they'll import, maybe through the port of LA or wherever it may be, a port of Long Beach, and then just, truck it down to Mexico without actually, releasing the customs bond, and then store it in Mexico and one by one ship over from Mexico using Section 321. So I wonder if it's just affecting goods directly from China. Is it also affecting goods from Mexico? Because there are quite a few companies that, ship out of Mexico using Section 321 and this, de minimis rule.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that we'll kind of see how this plays out. And they're writing the legislation. So I'm sure that lobbyists associated with Shein and Temu are going to try to water it down as much as they can. But, I could see that if they just block stuff coming from China, that's just going to cause a huge warehousing boom in Mexico and Canada because they still want that 321. And even with the $2 surcharge, it probably still makes sense for most brands coming in to pay that additional tax. But we'll see. I mean, I think that where Congress probably should go through is just try to rewrite the rules entirely for these sorts of shipments and just say, hey, if it's in Mexico, Canada, Botswana, wherever, we're going to treat it the same, and then try to force that volume into the U.S. Would probably be the right thing from a political economy point of view.
Yeah, it makes sense. What caught my eye was Mars, the kind of global snack and candy brand that owns M&M's, Snickers, Skittles, Kind Bars. They're acquiring the snack maker Kellanova for nearly $36 billion in cash, which I mean just caught my eye because it's such a huge number, $36 billion in cash. And Kellanova, which was spun off from Kellogg in 2023, is the home to a lot of snack brands like Cheez-Its, Eggo, RX Bar, Pop Tarts, and more. And it was reported that they did $13 billion in revenue last year, nearly $1 billion in net income. So, I mean, I know there's so many upstart CPG brands out there. I'm drinking, Liquid Death. That's one of them. And you think, okay, Liquid Death, we had a great episode on them in season one. They're now planning potentially for an IPO, it looks like next year. And, you see their revenue, I think it was at a few hundred, maybe 100 to 200 million or so now. And you compare that to the size of some of these other kind of CPG brands, Liquid Death is still very, very small in comparison. And so I'm going to be curious to see how it performs in the public markets. And it just was kind of this like, wow, there's a huge, huge market out there. And a lot of these kind of e-commerce CPG brands are just skimming the surface. So that was one thing that caught my eye. The other one was we've talked along this theme of kind of the convergence of creators and commerce, right? I'm super bullish on this thesis. And so I saw that Ariana Grande partnered up with Luxe Brands to expand her fragrance portfolio. And I mean, I think we've just seen so many of these kind of like cosmetic type of brands driven by creators, whether it be like Kylie Cosmetics or whatever it may be. And they've had so much success. And so I think it's just a playbook that continues to be repeated. And I mean, I'm sure there's quite a lot of duds out there that we don't hear about, but the winners are pretty substantial, right? I mean, it's like there's Florence Mills by Millie Bobby Brown. I mean, there's so many to really dive into. So really, really interesting thread. But I think it's time. Let's talk about ButcherBox. But I guess before we do, I'm curious, Aaron, what is your favorite or most expensive steak that you've had that you can recall?
Man, I am not one to kind of want to spend a lot of money on steak, although I think I would like to maybe have a $500 steak one time just to see if it was worthwhile. But the memory that comes to mind is I was in Las Vegas a couple months ago visiting a vendor, and they took us and a bunch of other people out, and we went to this fancy steakhouse, and they had this thing that was like $64 an ounce, I think is what they sold. They sold it by the ounce. And so this thing was a $700 steak that was there. And I don't think it could have been that good, but I'm just surprised by the fact that that's on the menu and people order it all the time. But I think I had a modest $130 steak, and it was good. It was great. I just can't imagine.
$100 for a steak is still expensive. So, I mean, we'll talk about the pricing of ButcherBox today, but it is interesting to see, how pricing of steak varies so much. I mean, I think for me, when I think about like my best steak, it actually comes from an experience I had in Alaska. I was at like a kind of backpacking hunter's lodge, if you will. And, I guess it was elk actually, but someone had, gotten an elk probably just, I don't know, less than 48 hours prior and hauled it back into the lodge. And that night they made fresh elk. And like, it was just an incredible experience to like know the person that, hunted this animal that, then cleaned the meat and everything that goes into it. And so, it was just a very memorable experience. And though it wasn't necessarily expensive from a dollar amount, it was very rich in terms of the experience of having that.
You remind me of the worst steak that I ever had. And I think I was in college. I was driving through West Virginia, and we stopped at this restaurant called Shoney's. I don't know if you have ever heard of this, but it's like a local thing, kind of in the Midwest. And they had a $2 steak, and it tasted like $2 was a generous amount to pay for it. It was a pretty rough thing.
Wow. Well, I guess let's start with the history of meat, right? I mean, before we dive into ButcherBox and how it was founded and the founders themselves, do you want to kind of give an overview of the meat industry and kind of the meat retail industry?
Yeah, so humans have been eating meat for a very long time. About 2.5 million years ago is when anthropologists believe that humans first started hunting animals and consuming meat. And this was actually a really important piece from our evolution point of view. There's a high nutrient density in meat, and there's high caloric content. And so this is what allowed our ancestors to have the extra calories to develop their brains and do those sorts of things. So eating meat directly led to bigger brains and more sophistication. Um, gathering meat was something that was very social and cognitive. And so you had to coordinate with other people. You had to, scare the animal into a certain area, and then you had to kind of all gang up on it. And so this was a huge piece in just the evolution of our bodies, as well as physiologically and socially how humans developed. In about 10,000 BC, livestock started to become domesticated, and this led to more stable meat supplies. And so that people realized they didn't have to go chase it; they could just like keep it there, and then they'd have meat that's ready there. In 2500 BC, Egyptians and Mesopotamians, they started to preserve meat, and so you start seeing things like salting and drying and stuff like that. So you didn't have to have it fresh immediately like you had in Alaska. Then from like 500 to 1500, there was the creation of butchers' guilds in Europe. And so they were really standardizing the practice of meat quality. And these guilds had an enormous amount of power in medieval times. They were able to you think about who's controlling the food supply, and they had huge political power. They won favor with lords and things like that. And things really didn't change a whole lot since the Middle Ages up until the 1700s. And in 1728, we had our first meat packing plant, which opened in Boston, Massachusetts. At 1783, Nicholas Appert invented canning, which revolutionized meat preservation. Today we would think that canned meat would be awful, but that was really the great way to do it. Is you could separate when the animal was harvested to when you ate it. It was a good thing there. 1830s, you started to see the invention of refrigerated rail cars, which basically was insulated rail cars where they cut ice out of lakes and store it there, and that's would basically keep the meat cooler as it traveled. And then really starting in the 1900s, a lot of things changed. 1906, we had the Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as the Meat Inspection Act. And this was really to ensure better standards in the USA. Things had gotten a little bit off kilter, if you want to call it there. There was really no standards around what was safe, what was good quality. So this is where you start to see the beginning of USDA certifications, things like that. In the 1950s, there's the increase of frozen foods and supermarket chains, which changes how people buy meat. Up until the 1950s, people went to a local butcher, and they just kind of said, hey, I want that piece. Whereas now with supermarkets and cold chain, you start to see these things there. And then really the last evolution in the last 20 years has been in the 2000s, 2010s, there's been an increase in e-commerce, subscription boxes, as well as, a focus on plant-based alternatives, sustainable meat, things like that.
It is pretty crazy to see how much the meat industry has changed in the past just 50 years. I mean, really before the invention of refrigeration and, cold storage and all of that. I mean, you couldn't really transport meat efficiently or effectively without it going bad, really. So, I mean, it's pretty incredible to see how much has changed just in the past, dozen or so years. I don't know another industry where refrigeration has impacted it as much as the meat industry, really. I mean, it's changed drastically.
Maybe ice cream, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, ice cream too, and I am a big ice cream eater, so that is a good point. But I mean, yeah, that's what stuck out to me. And now I think too, there's kind of like this trend which is aligned with what ButcherBox has done of leaning more into grass-fed meat and leaning into more natural processes to grow cattle. Whereas a lot of times I think in the early 2000s and 1990s, it was very like mass production. How do we produce cattle at scale, which I think is now kind of changing a bit, and a lot more of our consumers are becoming more conscious of, hey, how is my meat actually raised? What are these cows eating, and everything above? And that kind of gets us into the story of ButcherBox. And so ButcherBox was founded by Mike Salguero. He was actually born in Paraguay, and when his parents got divorced, his mother moved him to Massachusetts, and he actually lost contact with his father then. So he got his BA in business from Boston University and an MBA from Babson. For those who don't know, Babson is like a very kind of diehard entrepreneurial type of college and university. So it is cool to see that Mike went to Babson, because I think it's very aligned with his story. But since high school, Mike knew he wanted to dedicate himself to business. He didn't really feel challenged by courses. So, even in college, he began working right away. He would kind of quote unquote get his lessons from the streets and started selling products and food at Fenway Park, and eventually got into real estate. And that's how he learned to love sales. So, he eventually graduated early with an average GPA in 3.5 years. And, he kind of became this activist, right? He didn't like that corporations, were ruling the world, and he wanted to do things that were different. And so he, basically says, unfortunately, capitalism is the rule of the game was one of the quotes. And so I think this is like kind of a trend in business where a lot of entrepreneurs and founders, especially in the past few decades, have tried to create businesses for good, right? I think of like Honest Tea and Seth Goldman and his whole mission in a bottle, right? And I think it's really aligned with Mike. And I guess I'm curious, like, have you seen this actually work in business where a founder sets out of, instead of starting a nonprofit, they set out to create a business that does good for the world, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly our generation and generations younger are clinging to something that has meaning. I know for myself, when I'm going out trying to think about what I want to do, what kind of impact I want to make on the world, there are a certain amount of values and certain way that I want to conduct myself, my business, and the products that I support. And so I think that there are a lot of people that are going out and have this mission that is almost as important as what they're doing from a commercial point of view. Now, I think that it's important that those are balanced. I think sometimes, uh, you can get into situations where maybe the business is taking a stance on something that it doesn't really impact, right? But I think that if I'm a food company, I should care a lot about clean water and sustainable agriculture and things like that. I probably don't need to make comments on other aspects that maybe aren't as important, but that's just my perspective there.
Makes sense. Well, for Mike, so he really wanted to learn more about sales. He wanted to get into sales. So he did real estate. And what he says is the experience of being rejected in sales is the key to run a company. And so he learned, through real estate, the hard way of getting rejected. And I think the main takeaway from his experience as a real estate agent was he met his partner, Seth Rosen, there. And Seth Rosen would later become his partner in his first company, Custom Made, which we'll talk about in a second. And so, after working as an agent for a bit, he went to go live in South America to reconnect with his father. When he got back, he actually, kind of created this T-shirt that went viral that was against President Bush and turned into his first business. And the T-shirt had a design that said Bush Fush, I guess. So BUCKFUSH, and intentionally switched. Yeah, intentionally switching the first letters of the words. And it's kind of crazy. He sold 17,000 shirts, but somehow made no money out of it, right? He says, I just didn't know what I was doing at the time. And that's when he went off and got his MBA, which was paid for by the real estate company he had been working with. And this is kind of how he stumbled into Custom Made. So him and his partner, Seth, were looking for a business to buy. And Seth really came across this website while looking into a table for himself. It was a site created, really early in the .com boom in 1996, but it had awesome SEO due to the term custom. And so this was '08 when real estate was terrible. Mike got laid off and the opportunity to buy the site appeared. So they did it. Their strategy was, hey, can we modernize the site and raise prices to easily generate more cash flow? And they knew they needed to raise the number of people selling on the site, right? It was this marketplace of, buyers and sellers with kind of custom made wood items. And so, they paid the original team with equity and the site launched. However, it turned out to be awful, right? I mean, people found it really hard to list their services on it. It wasn't, nearly as easy as it is today to, list something on Facebook Marketplace or wherever it may be. And since their business model only relied on charging for the listings, they found it hard to attract interest from investors. So, this is at the time, though, that marketplaces are all the rave and hype, right? Investors had just kind of started to fundraise and fund Airbnb. And that was kind of what created this marketplace hype because Airbnb was growing so fast. And so it seems like they kind of were trying to follow this trend, right? And I guess I'm curious, Aaron, for you, in your experience, backing founders and running businesses, I mean, do you think it's smart to kind of raise and go off a trend that's hot at the time. What's your whole take on that?
It depends, right? Like I think a couple of years ago, if you said you were a blockchain CBD AI company, I think people would have written a check about it for any amount for just showing up. And I think that there's a certain element where, yeah, you do want to see where things are trending, and if you know that there's investor interest in the space, you should try to tap into it. But at the same time, I think you got to be true to who you are, right? If I want to sell quilts, I probably shouldn't be, saying that I'm a blockchain company, right? Like that's just not going to be a smart thing to do. And so I think that there are lots and lots of examples of companies that have said, "Oh, let's just change our domain to .ai because investors will think it's AI, or let's claim that there's AI in our software. In reality, it's like 0.1%, but it's actually just something different." So I think that there's an element of, yes, like give the market what it's looking for. At the same time, be honest and truthful what you're looking for, because this stuff always has a chance to, or always has a tendency of coming back to roost.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, at the end of the day, this business model unfortunately just didn't work. Woodworkers had a bad time offering their services on the platform, and there was just so much back and forth that it didn't make sense for them. And Mike says they kind of wrongfully pressed against their employees that were actually the right people, and they burned through cash really quickly, the money that they had raised. And he says that they thought that they kind of had been misguided by investors, and him and his co-founders were just kind of under great scrutiny and harsh judgment by these investors. And eventually they asked to replace him as CEO. But I think Mike's greatest regret of what he says running that company is he lost the culture of the company, right? And so I think it kind of goes back to his ethos of really instilling a strong culture in a company. And he says, quote unquote, a failed venture is not a failed entrepreneur, which I completely agree with and really, align with. I think every entrepreneur has a lot of trials and tribulations through their journey, and it's just a matter of time before you find success. So, Custom Made was later bought out of bankruptcy and pivoted to a jewelry site actually, and jewelry actually worked with this model. So, if you go to custommade.com, it's now a jewelry site. But that's kind of Mike's real first business that he's raised capital from. And I think as we'll see in this ButcherBox story, he realizes, hey, I don't really want to raise money from investors. And I guess it's interesting to see how he went from woodworking to meat. I mean, Aaron, do you want to touch on that transition?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if our listeners only walk away with one thing, I think that quote that a failed venture is not a failed entrepreneur, that is going to ring true over and over again. And when Matt exited Custom Made, he had this idea in 2015 for ButcherBox, and his wife has an autoimmune disease that required her to have an anti-inflammatory diet. And so, basically, as they were doing their research and they were figuring things out, they recognized that grass-fed beef would be key to this diet. And according to what they had seen, they said, okay, we want to be able to do this. This is what the research is supporting. And so I want to keep my wife on this diet so that she's as comfortable as she can be. And so he started to look around and tried to find grass-fed beef. And there were lots of groups out there that talked about the benefits of it, but there really wasn't any good access to this type of meat. You'd see interest groups where maybe it's CrossFitters or other people with diseases that needed anti-inflammatory that were saying, yeah, we want this, but we just don't know where to go. And so turned out that grass-fed beef was either very, very hard to find or incredibly expensive. And so his idea was, how do I go out and find a way to give accessible grass-fed beef to the masses? And so he felt that if the first thing he wanted to do is he wanted to reassess how people grade the quality of meat. And for most people, they look at it and say, okay, we want a high fat content. We want something that's super fatty, lots of marbling. That is really high quality beef. You hear about, the Wagyu beef and those sorts of things. And he said, you know what, I don't really want all that fatty stuff. I really want something that's lean because I think that's better. And so that was kind of one of the key stances that he took when he was looking to build his company. And so here he is. He decides, okay, I just got kind of pushed out of Custom Made. I'm pretty burnt out from that. I see that people want this. My wife needs it. Let me go start it. And so he decided that he was going to launch a food company, despite no experience in food and beverage or sourcing meat, how to pack it, how to ship it. And so it was kind of an audacious thing to think about when you take a step back. And he started to sell portions of meat to friends, and he would buy it from a farmer, and you'd have to buy like really large quantities. So it'd be like, hey Nathan, we're going to split half a cow. Well, that could last us a whole year. And so he'd say, well, if I can go through this in a month or two, let me find 10 other people, and we'll just kind of partition this half cow and be there. And so he started doing this. This was working decently well. And eventually people said, hey, you know what? I love what you're doing here. Is there a way you could just deliver the meat to me? And that was really what was the nucleus of what would be ButcherBox. And so they started to ship this meat on a monthly basis and weren't really aware of the right way to go about doing that. And I just love this story so far because it's really somebody who's falling into there's this need. Let me start it in the scrappiest way possible. I'm not thinking about building $1 billion business. I'm just thinking about how to literally provide for my wife and serve a need that my friends see. And I think it's awesome that way.
And it's a real need, right? I mean, I've had friends with autoimmune diseases that have gone, to an all meat diet and seen significant improvements. I mean, it's really fascinating to see how I think now this is probably more common than it was. And, Mike and ButcherBox has really enabled that access to high quality meat for people that otherwise wouldn't be able to access it. And I think this next bit is pretty incredible, right? Because it goes to show how important key players are in your business, right? Because Mike kind of realizes that he's not really sure if they're shipping meat in the most efficient or effective manner. And so at the time, kind of the biggest company that's shipping steaks across the country is Omaha Steaks. And so he actually reaches out to the head of operations on LinkedIn. So just through a LinkedIn message, reached out to the head of operations who actually had recently left Omaha Steaks. And so he was willing to help Mike. And, it's this incredible story of Mike partnering and starting to, really understand what the operation should look like with Ron Icky, who got, equity in ButcherBox and really helped build ButcherBox to what it is today from scratch. And so I'm just curious, Aaron, has that ever occurred to you? I mean, I know I've reached out to so many people on LinkedIn and through Twitter, and it's just a lot of times turned into some great, really valuable connections. And I think that is really the power and benefit of social media, especially for an entrepreneur, to kind of, find a network and, help people unlock those avenues for growth, or in this case, operations.
Yeah, I think when you're genuine and you are, not, you don't have an angle, other than just like, hey, I've got a question. I find that most people want to help, right? I think it's on LinkedIn. I don't know if this would work today because it seems like every LinkedIn message that I get is, hey, how you doing? You're doing great. I'd like to sell you this thing, which is, you don't respond to those, but I think this is awesome. I think it's great to pay it forward when you can. But I like you said, I love this part of the story because this is really where ButcherBox goes from an idea or a project to a business. And what Ron Icky is the guy's name. So they bring him in, they give him equity, and they build the company from scratch. And Mike had laid out a vision of almost Omaha Steaks, and that's what he thought he was going to build. But really just with monthly subscription around grass-fed beef. And what Ron showed is like, look, yeah, you should sell steaks, but there's so many other types of meat that would be great to include in this. And so he connected Mike with a connection who was able to solve all of their needs at once because of vertical integration. So now you have chicken and pork and beef and all those sorts of things. Ron also from Omaha Steaks knew all of the best companies in Iowa that could help source this beef. And they really were able to skip the line just by finding people who had done this at scale before and just knew who to talk to and had those relationships. And so when they got to the point where they were going to incorporate ButcherBox, Mike only had $10,000 to start the business, and that really wasn't enough for what was going through. And because of the issues that he had with Custom Made, he's like, look, I'm not bringing on any other investors. I don't want to do this. And so he made kind of the commitment that he was never going to raise money again. and he didn't want to deal with that outside influence. And so, here it is. He's got this great blueprint of how to actually run a really great business. He's proven demand with his friends, and now he's getting started, but he needs these startup funds. So he turns to Kickstarter and probably has one of those successful Kickstarters ever. If I was Kickstarter, I would have this on the homepage of like, hey, this is what happens. But you basically go there and they said, okay, we want you to pledge. We'll give you some swag. In addition to the butcher boxes and subscriptions, maybe we'll give you a whole barbecue for you and 20 of your friends, with someone like Mike flying from wherever they are to their house with the meat. And this was an amazing kind of thing that they did, because it kind of went viral to some extent. And the content they generated was really the key to what they were doing, because they had the right message and they reached their ICP, and it just exploded. And they raised so much more on Kickstarter than they expected. They had, I think it was 1,155 backers that pledged $210,000 to help bring the project to life. And so this was something, again, they just probably needed 50K or so. They blew through that expectation. And all of those Kickstarter supporters turned into subscribers. And so they got 60% of those 1,100 Kickstarters turned into subscribers from day one. So just imagine, you're running a subscription business, you're charging, 100, 200 bucks a month, and you get 600 people instantly that sign up and say, hey, we're going to do this. And you start to jumpstart and launch that company forward on a super strong trajectory that they never had to raise money.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a great way to fund the business, and subscription is key in any e-commerce company. So to see that they were able to get these early backers on Kickstarter to convert to subscribers and loyal customers was really a huge unlock for their business. I mean, I think I don't quite know what the standard terms are in terms of payment terms for meat and working with meat suppliers, but cash flow is such a challenge in any growing e-commerce business, that this was just such a huge unlock for them to know they had subscription revenue coming in. And I think it's really kind of such a great way to fund and launch and grow a business, is to really focus on subscription. I've even seen it in today's world of high growth e-commerce brands, whether it be, Mudwater, that coffee alternative. You go on their website, it's hard to figure out how to buy a product one time. I mean, they always are trying to, funnel you into a subscription. And that's just the way that, most e-commerce brands in today's, economy have to work. So, I mean, I guess, it's been awesome to see, but they also had like a kind of genius referral program, right, Aaron?
Yeah, they did. So basically what they did is they started working with influencers, and there were lots of people in like the diet space, the exercise space, the CrossFit space that, were building a following. And so what they did is they said, hey, we are going to do a referral program. And instead of just saying, hey, we're going to, pay you $20 for every subscriber that we get, they said, look, we are going to give you a percentage of the subscription for everybody that signs up through you. And so that means that if I have one person that signs up one time and they are a subscriber for 10 years, I'm going to pay you for 10 years. And nothing like this had ever been done before. And this was super popular to influencers, because one of the things that they struggle with is, okay, I have this following, I'm doing all this work to create this content, but how do I monetize it? And by being able to build ongoing residual income with ButcherBox subscriptions helps them improve their lifestyle and gets it in there. And so, it's the American dream, right? You get a check for doing very, very little. And this really brought exponential growth, because they started to share it among themselves. And then they just got more and more successful. And what was really genius about this program was there have been other companies that have tried to do what ButcherBox has done. And they go after these same influencers and say, hey, we'd love to pay you $5,000, $10,000 to do a sponsored post about our meal kit delivery or our meat subscription. But these creators are incentivized to not do that, because they would much rather sell someone on ButcherBox and continue to take that little small portion of revenue, versus getting their existing ButcherBox subscribers to switch over to something different. And so they've kind of built this moat where they didn't tell people this, right? But they built this moat where these influencers are kind of locked in, and they're being paid each month on ButcherBox. And so ButcherBox is always top of mind. They're always looking to push people onto that subscription. but then they're also, not willing to engage with other meat subscription companies out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a great strategy, and I think helped fuel their growth in a profitable way. One other note that stood out to me, I talked briefly about kind of terms before, but one kind of fascinating part is that a key provider of their meat was really bad at billing them, and so it allowed them to have almost 5 weeks of float with financing their venture. Right. So not only did they have a great referral strategy that helped them grow profitably in that end, in that regard, but they also on the actual supplier side kind of had some terms that enabled them to grow in a profitable manner. And investors started to notice, right? Mike started to get hit up by a lot of investors, and just from his experience with custom made, I think he just realized, hey, I can do this myself. We're profitable. We can control our own destiny here. And so he kind of decides to reject all of these investors, especially given the timing of like the Blue Apron fiasco. If you remember, Blue Apron raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and basically ended up burning through that capital and being quite a bit of a dud. I think they actually just recently got reacquired by another company called Wonder that had raised more venture capital. So the story continues for Blue Apron, but that just made him realize, hey, I want to keep at this myself. And the growth milestones of the company really are pretty incredible, right? I mean, 2015, Mike gets the idea for creating this company. 2016, basically their first full year of business, they do about $5 million in revenue. Fast forward 2018, Mike launches this ButcherBox Kickstarter campaign, and so that's where they really fuel the business even more with $210,000 from that. 2019, they do $225 million in revenue, which is just insane. And 2020, they basically double to $450 million in revenue, $500 million in 2021. That's insane to think about. Just can't imagine how many steaks that is. I mean, put $500 million in your brain into steaks and just try to guesstimate how many steaks that is. I have no clue, but it's a lot of food. And then 2024, ButcherBox has now bought Truffle Shuffle, which is a company that specializes in providing the finest truffles and creating great truffle products. So it's kind of become this like platform play, if you will, which is kind of cool because I know we've seen that with Harry's, which was the episode we did in season 1, where they've become now this kind of e-commerce conglomerate. And it seems like ButcherBox is taking a similar type of strategy of, buying other, niche, but very high quality food brands that have some scale to add to their kind of, whole strategy.
Yeah, no, I think first off, like launching and year one having a $5 million business, that's pretty good. But then it's also, you think about this, the fact that they had to go on Kickstarter because they only had 10K in funds. It's like, what happened with all that? Like, they had to kind of learn how to do the business, and maybe margins weren't great. But I mean, to go from 5 million in 2016 to 225 in 2019 to over 500 million now is just it's remarkable. And to own 100% of that business is just it's awesome. Like, couldn't be happier for Mike.
Yeah, it is incredible. And I mean, on the supply chain side, I'm not a meat sourcing expert by any means, but I think it's really interesting to see that ButcherBox really focuses on a deep relationship with their customer, but the product is primarily source shipped by third parties, right? So they're not vertically integrated. I mean, we've talked about other companies that have vertically integrated their production, but ButcherBox works with third parties on that end. They have very high quality standards that you can see, across their website. But I think the biggest challenge with their supply chain is actually shipping meat, because meat needs to be shipped with dry ice. So that's really heavy and eventually evaporates. And so something that they did that was pretty revolutionary was the company, could choose exactly what you got in each box to kind of make sure they're utilizing the most space in the box. Instead of having like one steak and a piece of dry ice, they really try to maximize that space in the box, and that helped them reduce the number of SKUs they needed to hold at any time, while also reducing the inventory cost, and made sure that the meat that they were keeping was more sustainable and moving faster in their pipeline. Right, you don't want a steak sitting at their vendor for a week or whatever it may be. So it's pretty interesting to see how they've been able to manage that with third parties. And sustainability is a huge value prop of the company. If if you go to butcherbox.com, you can see this really all across their website. And they try to find ways to raise animals in a sustainable way, right? It's not like they're really trying to cage all these cows all at once. They really talk about grass-fed meat and their raising process and all of that, and really to kind of create this carbon negative effect of beef, if you will, which I think is changing the script compared to a lot of these larger companies in the industry.
Yeah, there's two things specifically about the supply chain that I thought were really interesting. The first one is the fact that the customer doesn't pick what goes in their box. And you would think that that would just be antithetical to what most people do. It's like, oh, I want to give more choice. I want to be able to pick that I want, 2 chicken legs and a steak and some pork chops. But they look at this and say, we're going to remove the decision from the customer, and we're actually going to make that a feature and not a bug. And the biggest challenge you have when you're dealing with fresh food is around spoilage. And so the fact that they can basically run their operations in such a way that they know that they have a certain amount of calories or weight or expectations that the customers are having each month. The fact that they can look at this and say, all right, we're going to allocate our inventory accordingly so that we basically run out of everything and preserve our shelf life, provided that we don't lose 30% of our customers, is so smart. I mean, the fact that they don't have to hold inventory in perpetuity just in case someone wants to buy buffalo chicken wings opens up, one, a lot of cash, but two, just reduces the waste enormously. And so I think that, at least I've seen this a little bit, and I'm curious to get your perspective. I've seen this trend toward taking away decisions from consumers and doing more curation as being kind of a mega trend that's going on. Whereas in the past, it's been like, hey, walk through and figure out all these different ways to subscribe or figure out what goes in your box. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think in general, most e-commerce brands, they want to have a lower SKU count, right? I think, clothing businesses, for example, are so hard, or shoe businesses are so hard because you have so many SKUs, right? Different sizes, different colors, everything. Whereas if you have like a supplement brand, or in this case, a meat, brand, there's probably, a lot of different cuts of steak, obviously, there's not a ton of variety in SKU count. And so I do think a lot of companies that are really trying to scale up in today's world are limiting their SKU count to focus on a few marquee SKUs that can get them to scale, that can really, push their margins home. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great strategy all around. I mean, I think a lot of these subscription-oriented companies are focusing on that in today's world. I'm curious on the exit side of the business. I think like there's been a lot of talks of, where does ButcherBox go from here, right? I'm curious, what's your take? What happens to ButcherBox? Are they going to get bought? Are they going to go public? Where do you think they end up?
I wouldn't do a thing if I were him. I would keep doing what's doing, let it keep growing. You're profitable. It's up and to the right. I mean, I think there will be a point where maybe the growth starts to plateau. Maybe you're looking for other stuff. But again, if you had a $500 million business and it was guaranteed to never grow above $500 million, but it was profitable, would that be the worst thing ever? No. Like, I think most people would say, yeah, I'll take a business that isn't growing, but it's profitable off of a base of 500 million. And so I think that there's a piece here where, in much the same way that Mike was questioning how we rate beef, right? And how we go about dealing with investors that they got. I think there's a thought here of, once they reach that natural plateau, is it something that they need to continue to grow? Or is it really just a matter of protecting what they have, making sure they're profitable, making sure they still deliver an amazing experience for their customers? But I would like, personally, if it were me, I would keep it that. You look at companies like Blue Apron that were so hot for so long, only to crash just as quickly. Those subscription companies are not really that attractive anymore to venture capital or on the public markets. And so I think the key thing here is going to be, what's the churn? How much is ButcherBox spending to acquire new customers? How long are those customers sticking around? And as long as they have the subscription economics good, they're going to be great. But I think once you start to get on this growth treadmill, whether it's brought on by investors or it's brought on by public markets, it's really, really difficult to not spin yourself into bankruptcy.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, and I think too they're maybe growing a bit through acquisition, right? They acquired that truffle brand, and I'm sure they're looking at some other products to potentially acquire and create this kind of umbrella type of company. So they've got the right people and team in place to scale and continue to grow these other brands. So we'll see what happens. Maybe they kind of create this umbrella strategy similar to what we discussed on the Harry's episode last season. So this was an incredible episode. I mean, really inspired by ButcherBox. I think their process and growth story is phenomenal and incredible. I mean, it's very rare that we get to discuss a company that's gotten to this scale being bootstrapped. I mean, that really stuck out to me. And I love Mike's quote about a failure is not a failed entrepreneur, right? I think that's an amazing takeaway from this for any other founders that are listening, and really appreciate everyone tuning in to this episode of E-commerce on Tap. This is the start of our second season. I know Aaron and I are both very excited for this season. We've got a lot of cool companies coming up, but Aaron and I also love to hear from you, right? So if you see us on Twitter or LinkedIn posting about an episode, definitely comment, share your feedback. And if you have a company that you want us to cover on E-commerce on Tap, just let us know, and we'll try to do a deep dive on them. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcefy and ISBA. We look forward to tuning in next time.